The way Silicon Valley startups work is this combination of the magic and then exceptional execution. And when you lie to yourself and then you lie to your team, you are killing the magic. And when the magic is gone, you cannot bring it back. Listen up, everyone. Great startups are built with great people, and there are great people everywhere in the world. But have you ever thought of all the headaches that hiring a global team can create? Entities, compliance, payroll, equipment, provisioning, and more. You're here to build a great startup, not become a global HR expert. But don't give up on the dream. Our sponsor, Deal, is an all-in-one HR platform specifically built for global teams. All those problems instantly solved. Learn more at deal.com/TSP. That's DEEL.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast, a show focused on helping you build, run, and invest in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're an investor, founder, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights on the principles that power high-growth disruption the way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now. Hey, I'm Chris.
And I'm Yaniv, and today we want to talk about founders. Are you actually lying to yourself? And are you lying to others? And in particular, are you really aiming for greatness?
Yeah, that's right, Yaniv. You meet a lot of founders who are running startups, right? I say that in quote marks if you're not watching the video. And they're very excited about their startup. And they're out there looking for angel investors or VC. They're building apps or software-based companies. They're very excited about the other companies they see in the App Store, Slack, Instagram, or Facebook or Uber. And they want to act in that way. That's the culture, that's the example, that's the excitement, that's the energy, that's the ambition that they have, and that's the thing that's motivating and animating them. They want to be Silicon Valley great, right? This whole show is about Silicon Valley style startups, and they are ostensibly in the game to build a Silicon Valley style startup.
A unicorn, a billion-dollar company, right?
Yeah, that's right. But once you start scratching the surface and digging a little deeper, they seem to be lying to themselves. They're making compromises about their vision, about their decision-making, about the way they hire, about the way they design their business model, about the way they execute, which belies the fact that they maybe don't actually have conviction about being a Silicon Valley-style startup. Maybe they don't think they're good enough, or maybe they don't know what that really means, or the kind of risks, or the kind of growth, or the kind of behavior that it takes to be a Silicon Valley style startup. I think it's worth noting here, Yaniv, and it's something you mentioned as we were designing the run sheet. In this show, I think it's very easy to listen to us and feel like we're making or passing judgment on people who have decided to build small businesses, traditional businesses, non-Silicon Valley style companies. And it sounds like we're perhaps really down on that idea and we feel like those companies aren't legitimate in some way. And I think that's misreading our position. I think it's simply that this show is called The Startup Podcast, and we talk about Silicon Valley style startups. And so what we're talking about is people who are ostensibly committed to building that kind of company, but are acting in misalignment with that stated intention. And that's where things get really toxic and really corrosive and really compromised. It's the pretending, it's the misalignment with their stated goal that we think is wasteful and ultimately a bad deal for the founder, for investors, for the ecosystem, and for generally progress in the world using great companies as a mechanism for that progress.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chris. In a way, as you were speaking, I'm thinking, you know what? We're actually saying to people, maybe you shouldn't be listening to this show. And the point here is that there is a lot of, I guess, focus on and emphasis on and adulation of the unicorn, the billion-dollar startup, the sort of global world-changing venture-backed Series C, Series D, IPO giant company. And that software in particular, and we'll get into this a little bit later, software and technology is the perfect place for building those sorts of businesses. And I think that the toxicity here, the problem is exactly as you say it, Chris, is people who believe that that's what they are building. At some level, they believe it. At some level, they profess it. They say, we want to be the next billion-dollar company. They seek venture capital funding on that premise. They hire employees on that premise. They make business decisions on that premise up to a point. But at some level, they're like, I'm not so sure that that is what I'm trying to build. And that comes in a few ways, right? First of all, some of the feedback we get from listeners here is like, hey, trying to do this venture-backed billion-dollar company thing is super risky, right? Most companies that try to do this fail. And other things people say is you end up as a founder with maybe not that much equity and not that much control at the end of that business because you've had to raise so much outside capital. Better to bootstrap and get a bigger slice of a smaller pie and so on. And to me, it's not one is better than the other. That's not actually the point. The point is, and this is where we come to this episode, right, is know the game you're playing and play it. If you want genuinely to take that massive swing and say, I'm going to try to build a company that is globally significant, that level of scale and impact and complexity and importance to the world that it can be worth multiple billions of dollars, then you have to have a certain mindset. And that mindset will involve pretty significant risks of total failure. It will involve a lot of stress. It will involve probably raising a lot of outside capital, although not definitely. Whereas if you want to build a bootstrap company that you retain control of, or if you want to build a services business, a technology-backed services business, that's fine. But what is not fine, and that is what we really want to hammer home, is to say you're doing one thing, building the billion-dollar startup, but then to act like you're doing something else. And that creates all sorts of problems, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
So the thing that really inspired us to address this topic today was this question of greatness. It's an observation I made in my work where founders seem to, when presented with what it takes to be great, to execute really well as a Silicon Valley style startup, they will often demur. They'll often say, well, our kind of company can't do that. We can't do that. We can't hire that well. Our team isn't good enough to execute like that. Our business is too complex. We can't, or we don't know, or it's too risky to sell direct to customers, or we need to maintain optionality, or we don't have conviction about that direction, or our product isn't good enough for that kind of growth. And these kind of inherent self-limiting beliefs that when you dig under the surface, they just don't believe they're good enough to be a great Silicon Valley company. And so it almost comes back to an episode, Yaniv, we did about conviction, but it's this lack of conviction that they really are building a Silicon Valley style company, or maybe that they're good enough to build one, or that they deserve to build one, or that the principles of great Silicon Valley companies apply to their special snowflake company. And so there's this underlying soft belly of defeatism or imposter syndrome, or really a lack of faith in themselves, in their market, in their country, in their customers, in their team, in their investors, in one or all of those things that leads them to be making a series of compromised decisions along the way.
But Chris, maybe they're right.
Well, maybe they are right? They're possibly right for two reasons, I think, Yaniv, at least two reasons. The first is the only people who are crazy enough to believe they can change the world usually are the only ones who do. So you have to be a little crazy to actually believe you can change the world, to build something great. And if you don't believe that you're good enough, and you don't believe in your ambition, and you're not a little crazy, then maybe you aren't good enough to change the world. Maybe you aren't good enough to build that Silicon Valley style company. So your lack of belief in and of itself may be the thing that's limiting your potential to achieve that outcome. And then the second way I think is really important, it's related, but it's different, is because you keep relitigating the decision or relitigating your circumstances and interjecting, hedging, and executing in compromised ways, ways that infiltrate the whole company, right? We've talked in previous episodes about how culture is set at the top. Because you are acting like you don't believe, all of your actions and all of your culture and all of your outcomes will reflect that belief. And so you will basically create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so you're right, Yaniv. If those who don't believe they're good enough, or believe one of those other things that I said, which are causing that compromise, they're probably right, unless and until they unearth those hidden beliefs and ultimately correct them and start acting in a more aligned and more faithful way to their stated goal.
I agree with that, but I'd also go a little bit further or broaden it out a bit. And again, going back to our disclaimer, there are many ways to build a business that is not a Silicon Valley style startup. So if you don't have the conviction to build the Silicon Valley style startup, you've got two valid approaches that I'm not going to judge you for, right? One is to find that conviction, and the other is to stop trying to build a Silicon Valley style startup. And I think, Chris, when you talk about greatness and so on, you're nearly injecting a value judgment there that maybe shouldn't be there. Where we're saying, you know what, like if you're a bit crazy and you want to build this thing, and that's like, you're just going to leave it all out on the field, right? You're not going to be making necessarily the most prudent decisions, right? You are going hell for leather to build this thing, then that's what you should be doing. But perhaps what you want to do is make quite a lot of money, or you just want to build a good, solid business and become a solid member of the business community, or you want to bootstrap and you want to get this amazing freedom where you can work from anywhere in the world, then fantastic. Go do that. That's not a bad thing at all. Genuinely. I'm not saying this condescendingly. It's not a bad thing at all. But if you lack the conviction and yet you still say to yourself, start with saying it to yourself, but then when you say it to your stakeholders, to your investors, to your employees, to your customers, that this is what you're trying to build, but you pull your punches, right? You don't go for it because you're always hedging your bets and you're more worried about failing than you are excited about succeeding. Then there are all sorts of externalities. And that is what I believe both of us here, Chris, are really railing against.
Let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's unpack it, right? So,
Absolutely.
oftentimes a founder will say to me, should I go raise capital? Or should I move to Silicon Valley? Or should I do something more ambitious? Or I had a founder recently ask me, should I sell my company? It's actually like kicking off a whole bunch of free cash flow. I could probably sell it to this private equity firm that's doing a roll up in my space. Or is it worth raising capital? We've raised no capital so far. And my answer is often, it depends on the kind of person you are and the kind of company, by extension, you want to build, right? Let's say for the sake of argument, you're building a healthcare company. And if your goal is to just help individuals improve their well-being, and if you can touch 1 or 2 or 5 or 7 people a week and look into their eyes and know that you've made a personal difference in their life, then maybe you shouldn't be building a company. Maybe you should be a doctor or a nurse or a healthcare practitioner. If you are the kind of person who loves taking big, bold bets and who loves being out on a limb, who likes making ambitious moves in their life, they believe like, I only have one life and the more experiences I can have, the better. Maybe you're an entrepreneur. Maybe you should be building a high growth company. But if you're the kind of person who thinks about risk management a lot, and those people are very valuable people who can understand risks, but you tend to think about what are the possible downsides? How do you limit risk? How do you make sure that there is at least a reasonable outcome at the other end? Then maybe you're not a Silicon Valley style entrepreneur. If you're the kind of person whose ambition it is to build a reasonable sized company and sell it for a reasonable exit, 1, 2, 5, 10, even 50, $100 million, and pocket that, which is a life-changing amount of money for your family. You kind of dust your hands off and call that a win. That is an amount of money that nobody should sneeze at, right? And you are managing to that outcome. That is perfectly fine. But if you're the kind of person who's like, I don't really give a shit about what the financial outcome is. I want to touch 1 billion people's lives. I want them to feel better, act better. I'm willing to go out on that limb and I want to touch 1 billion people. I want to hit scale. And maybe I'll have $20, $50 million outcome. Maybe I'll have a 100 million, a 500 million, a $2 billion outcome.
Or a $0 outcome, or a $0 outcome.
Or a $0 outcome, right? Then if you're in that latter camp, maybe you'd be a great founder. And if you're in that former camp, maybe you wouldn't be a great founder. Maybe you should be managing to more of a small business, medium business mindset. And so again, Yaniv, I think you and I have said this a few times on this episode and a few times through the whole podcast. This is not about judging Silicon Valley startups as being a better business. It's about you and I love that model. This podcast is about that model. And so we will often reveal our bias toward that model. But the point of this episode is understand which model you're engaged in, because failure to do so is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it'll be painful and ultimately unproductive for you, your stakeholders, your investors, and everybody around you. Okay, Yaniv, so let's talk about some of the reasons why living in this duality, this world where your stated intention is to build a Silicon Valley style startup, but you actually have a lack of conviction or faith about that. How does that translate into actually compromising your execution and ultimately creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? What often happens is you will corrupt entire aspects of the business and then ultimately make the whole thing way harder on yourself and minimize your probabilities for success. So let me just rattle off some areas where this will happen, and then we can unpack each one in turn. So what you'll end up doing is having all sorts of constant relitigation of topics, principles, decisions where the company will constantly be arguing about whether they should go left or go right on every issue. And you're kind of wondering, why are we always debating these points? Why does it feel so hard to make a choice? There's constant misalignment where some people are going right and some people are going left and some people are going up and some people are going down. You end up hiring a B team or a C team and you have compromised hiring. You have a compromised business model where you go via incumbents and via partners. You have compromised execution, and you can often end up having an over-engineered tech stack that takes way, way longer to build. Now, the question is why? Why does all this happen? Let's unpack each one and talk about why these things occur when you are yourself kind of compromised and living in this duality.
So, Chris, I'd love to go into each of those in turn, and I think we'll do that. But I actually want to point out a common underlying set of root causes for this. And in fact, we had an episode around first principles thinking about a year ago. And I think what happens, why we end up with constant relitigation, constant misalignment, compromised hiring, and so on, is because We do not have a credible, common set of first principles from which we can reason, right? If we believe we're building a unicorn, but we're lying to ourselves, and we tell our internal stakeholders, we tell our external stakeholders, we tell everyone, hey, we're building a unicorn, this is our vision, this is what it means to achieve that vision, and so on, then whether you're explicit or implicit in laying down those underlying principles, all the internal stakeholders are going to walk away with a certain understanding of what principles, what are the rules underlying the business. But you're lying to yourself. So there's this other unwritten set of rules, right? This unwritten set of principles that are actually more about, hey, let's make sure this business doesn't die. Let's make sure that we sign on to deals because we want to have certainty of revenue. Let's make sure that we hit cash flow break even as early as possible. All of these other principles that don't really align with building this unicorn, this large Silicon Valley style startup. Well, they creep into the decision making, and they're the sort of untold external corrupting factor that muddies the waters and makes it impossible to have clear, first principle driven discussions. And I think nowhere is that more obvious or more pure than in this case of constant relitigation. And Chris, I know this is something that you get involved in a lot.
Yeah, that's right. And this list that I just walked through is all symptoms of that root cause, right? If you're working from different implicit assumptions and different implicit rules, then all of these other things will just be compromised and corrupted. And so let's talk about some very, very clear example that hopefully everyone can relate to. So if you're working from a principle of like, hey, we want to be a Silicon Valley style startup with a unicorn exit, but actually we want to maintain optionality, we want to have zero chance of failure, we want to bring in as much revenue as possible. Well, every choice you make will actually have like two underlying first principles motivations, right? As you said, Yaniv. And so one will be to optimize for the long term, and one will be optimizing for the short term. And so in every meeting, in every discussion, in every OKR review, there is this constant relitigation. Well, do we really want to focus on kind of short-term improvements to the product to try to just increase the conversion rate? Or do we want to rethink the product because we think there's a fundamental metaphor mismatch? Well, we can't rethink the product, even though that's the long-term better strategy, because we need to hit this month's or this quarter's OKRs, and the OKRs are about increasing conversion rate. Yeah, but the conversion rate's not the right answer. But yeah, but that's what we're told we have to do in the planning cycle. Yeah, but we want to build this epic company that is so like, and it's just like this loop. I've seen it so many times, Yaniv, so many companies that I work with. They're literally frozen in place because they are trying to split the difference. They're trying to build for the long-term unicorn while also solving for the short-term tactics. And because it's impossible to do both in many cases, it's impossible to thread that needle. They are constantly relitigating in rooms, both with the leadership team and with each other, such that they don't know where to go. Engineers don't know how much abstraction to add to a piece of code. The product managers don't know which thing to focus on to hit their OKRs. The leadership team doesn't know what advice to give in a given meeting and review. And it's all just a little bit crazy making, to the point where you'll have a founder or CEO come into a meeting and see something that is long-term optimized for that unicorn outcome. And they'll go, what are you guys doing? We should be more tactical in that. It's clear why our conversion rate's so low. Just fix the onboarding flow. And then the next meeting, it'll be like, why are you guys so like down in the weeds fixing the onboarding flow? You guys should be thinking about the long term and how do we fix this entire product? And it's like crazy making. It is crazy making. So every meeting, from the topmost executives to the lowly engineer and craftsperson who's trying to execute something, will have this kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing going on in their head, which slows everything down. And in the worst case, to a crawl, to an absolute crawl.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. A few things were going through my head. You talked about optionality, right? When you're a startup, you have far more options, things you could do, than you have the time or resources to pursue. And so, in fact, what you want to be doing with underlying principles, with an understanding of what you're trying to achieve, is to limit the number of decisions that you need to make, right? So that when an option comes in, you can reject it out of hand. You can say, that is not aligned with our principles, with our strategy, with our vision. You throw it out. And you and I might be talking about slightly different things here, but they both come down to relitigating. I'm thinking about opportunities that do not align with the long-term vision, right? A new partnership, a deal, right? We talk about technology-backed services company. A company offers to pay you $100,000 to do something for them. And if you were clear about your principles, you would say, no, we're not doing that because it's not on our roadmap, it's not aligned. But it's $100,000. That would bring us closer to break even, wouldn't it? So maybe we should consider doing this, right? And then you relitigate it. And you say, but last month we decided that we wouldn't do this. It's like, well, but perhaps we didn't know such a great opportunity would come along, and we should keep our options open. So we should keep talking to this company. And Chris, the other metaphor I was thinking about is you like fast cars. When you're trying to throw a racing car as fast as possible around a track, you are trying to minimize the weight that you carry, right? You don't keep a passenger seat and a couple of rear seats in case you want to pick up hitchhikers on the way. You don't have like air conditioning and shit. This thing's a racing car. You're not maintaining optionality. It's good at one thing only. And that's because you are not bringing all of these other factors in because you cannot afford to. As soon as you start compromising and keeping your options open with this vehicle, you're going to stop winning races. And that's what I see way too many times.
Yeah, I've had so many executives and founders say to me, yeah, but this deal is a really great opportunity. And I'm like, a great opportunity for what? It is a great opportunity for them, for you to solve their problem. If you said to anybody, hey, I can solve your problem, there's a really important problem for your business, they're going to say, fuck yeah, please come in and solve my problem. But that's not the problem you want to solve. That's not the opportunity you want. The opportunity you want is to become a multi-billion-dollar unicorn.
But you don't, right? And that is what it comes down to, because it is a good commercial opportunity.
Yeah, but if you have a singular focus, which is really what the episode is about today, if you have a singular focus on becoming that Silicon Valley style unicorn, then the bad deal is an opportunity to fuck that up. It's not an opportunity to improve your business. And so you have to ask yourself, who is it a good opportunity for? And what is it a good opportunity for? Chances are, if you're in this dualistic mindset, it's an opportunity to derail and distract your business. Another metaphor I used on LinkedIn recently was, if you keep on leaving the trail to investigate every sound you hear, you will quickly run out of water or fall off a cliff before you get to your destination. And so you need to understand what your destination is and stick to that trail, or you're going to run out of food and water and die. That's the most important thing to keep in mind.
As a startup founder, you cannot let yourself get distracted with the everyday admin of running a company. That's where today's sponsored Deal comes in. Deal's all-in-one HR platform does all the work of running a global team for you, so you can focus on changing the world. Go to deal.com/TSP to learn more.
All right, so the next area of compromise or corruption that creeps in when you're living in this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde duality is compromised hiring. You will hire people who are kind of mediocre. They're kind of around. They're kind of in front of you. They're kind of maybe good enough for now. They maybe have the wrong kind of experience. They come from a big bank or a big co, or maybe they have no experience at all. And you're like, yeah, they're going to be good enough for now. We just need to button a seat to solve this thing. Whereas if you were uncompromising in your vision that we want to build this unicorn, we are building a rocket ship, and we want the best people we can find in the world to help take us on that journey. Well, A, you would first have a very clear sense of your vision and why this is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. And B, you'd have a very clear sense of who you need to hire to help you achieve that multi-billion-dollar opportunity. You would no longer compromise on working with someone who costs a little less, or whose resume is a little worse, or whose clarity of thinking is a little more muddy, right? You would want the very best goddamn people. You would pay them as much as you're able to pay them, or give them commensurate equity. And you would fight tooth or nail to keep them on your rocket ship, because you need to get to the moon. I see a lot of compromised hiring out there in my advisory work, where they're kind of willing to take whoever's around, or to tolerate people who are suboptimal, or to maybe let go of people who are maybe a bit expensive in favor of just maximizing runway and making everybody else feel good about the kind of egalitarian salaries that are being paid.
Yeah, there's a few things that are really interesting there. First of all, I mentioned briefly earlier painting yourself into a corner. And one thing that is really hard to undo is a bunch of compromised hiring. If you talk about a company culture, if you talk about a culture of high performance and excellence, if you start bringing in people who solve the problem that's right in front of you, but don't help you scale towards what you're trying to build, you can often end up in a situation where your vision does become impossible to realize, because you simply have a business that's no longer, or an organization that is no longer able to bear the weight of that really big ambition. So I think that's a really significant thing. And then the other thought I had, Chris, is because, you mentioned a lot, like pay people a lot and whatnot. And one of the things I sometimes hear from founders is, I don't have the pull to hire the best people. I can't afford it. In my experience, really great people, really great startup people, right? Again, there are folks who are suitable for startups and folks who are not, but the really best startup people, they want to work for a company where there is a credible vision that is strongly expressed. And in a lot of cases where their personal circumstances allow it, they will take a step down in salary in order to join a purpose-driven organization that they believe in the leadership of. And so what I say to people is don't rule yourself out of hiring the best people before you've even tried, which is something I see way too often.
Well, yeah, this one really breaks my heart because I'll sometimes hear in my advisory work that, look, Chris, our team is just isn't good enough for this. Our team doesn't know how to do this. It breaks my heart on two levels. One is that they have really low faith in their own team, and they have really low faith in themselves, that they can't A, up-level their team, or B, go out and hire better people. And there are solutions to this. If you can't get over the hurdle of hiring great people, then again, back to this earlier point, maybe you're not a great Silicon Valley style founder and operator. As you said, Yaniv, hiring great people is not just about money. It's about having clarity of thinking, about a big, bold ambition. It's about knowing how to use LinkedIn and 6 degrees of separation to laser-like target the right person with the right message in the right way, and to essentially pitch them like you would an investor to get them across the line and into your company. And if you don't have enough faith in yourself and in your vision and in the team that you do have, then you are compromised before you even get out of the gate.
Yeah.
And so I think this bullet point is really about challenging founders to have more faith in themselves and more faith in their team and more faith in the ability for them to change the mix of their team or to bring coaches, advisors, and help along on the journey to supercharge everything they're doing.
Absolutely. So the next thing that we see when we lie to ourselves is we end up over-engineering.
Yeah, that's right. So you're lying to yourself. You're trying to maintain optionality. You have a whole bunch of weird and wonderful deals coming in that are not on strategy. And what ends up happening is that your engineering team notices. They notice that at any given time, you may need different functionality, different pipelines, different capabilities than what your stated product goals are. And so they start to build generalized platforms. They start to build these really sophisticated tools that can be configured to act in all sorts of ways, right? So they'll either just build a generalized platform, hoping that one day you'll decide what product you want to build, and then you could easily kind of collapse all that potentiality to one particular user experience. Or they've noticed each new requirement, each new customer contract has just completely different things that they need. And so what you end up doing is building these overcomplicated platforms with over sophisticated configurability, which takes way, way, way longer to build. And even after you build them, it's like trying to get to the horizon. You actually never end up building that fully flexible platform that can actually do all of those things. So you never actually get to the end. And worse, you never end up building a great product that an end user can pick up and use, because you've spent so much time building all of these code paths to maintain all this optionality, which you never ever get to the bottom of anyway. And so it ends up costing so much money and so much delay. And often when companies come to me and say, Chris, why is everything moving so slow down in engineering? And they'll also say, my CTO is so obsessed with building technology and building sophisticated tools, and I just can't get them to stop doing that. But when I dig a little deeper, what I realize is the CTO and the engineering team are acting completely rationally because they've been asked to do so many different things or been given such little specificity about what to do that they're trying to maintain that optionality and be good soldiers and make the platform do whatever will be asked of it next week.
What I was actually thinking, Chris, when you were talking, was that you are presenting a best case scenario. If your engineering team takes this sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation and ends up over engineering, you have a really good engineering team. I'll tell you what is more likely to happen is that you will end up with a absolutely terrible code base. The word technical debt will appear more and more often because what happens is every time new requirements come in and the time pressure is there because it's a deal or we need to move fast because we're a startup, the engineering team will hack some more crap into the code base until the code base becomes completely unworkable. And then they simply won't be able to add anything more, right? You literally slow things down to stasis where the code base is so fragile and so complex that even adding relatively simple new features becomes effectively infinite in length. And then you start having discussions about the dreaded rewrite. That is the most common and sad way that works. If all you have is over engineering, folks, you have got a great CTO. Give them a bonus.
Yeah, and I've been trying to find a diagram or a metaphor that tells this story really, really clearly. And the best I've got, and this is may still be quite confusing, but the best I've got is imagine a square. And that square contains all possible code paths and functionality and capabilities of your platform. And your team is busy beavering away building all of those capabilities in the square. But if you came to your team and said, hey, we just need this point, we need the product to do this one thing imagine the top of the square, you articulate a very precise point. Well, then you
Mm.
can draw a triangle down from that point and eliminate huge sections of that square. You're essentially drawing a triangle where you have the user experience at the top, some of the business logic and, front end logic and some of the back end logic. And the triangle is a much, much thinner slice of that square. And so oftentimes you'll meet engineering teams, CTOs, who are trying to build the whole square. But if you were able to come to them and say, no, John, no, Sally, we just need to be able to express this one point, and then they can just build the thin triangle underneath that point, which is just enough
Mm.
kind of back end, front end, user experience, and product marketing to meet the needs of that one point. And that's cutting away waste. You're cutting away a lot of that square to just build the triangle. Again, that may not be as clear as I'd like it to be because I still haven't found a great metaphor for this.
I can see where you're going with that analogy. What it made me think of is a term that's used in software engineering called domain modeling. What that means is trying to represent in software the actual business domain that you're working on. And it's actually quite a difficult skill. And it's something that is done between engineering, product manager, business analyst, or whoever it is who really understands the business well. And if you get your domain model right, you build simple, scalable, beautiful software. But to get the domain model right, you need to understand what your domain is. And so when you have this lying to yourself situation where you have this dichotomy between what you say your domain is and what the actual domain is, then the engineers have no chance to actually build a bit of software that makes sensible, sane assumptions, because any assumption they bake in will get broken by the next deal, by the next cool idea, by the next bit of optionality that you're trying to preserve. And so you kind of need to build software that does a little bit of everything, or else you'll come to regret it. So whether you call it the square and the triangle or something else, the fact that you are lacking that definition, where you're not saying this is what we do, and therefore these are all the things we don't do, make it all but impossible to have a clean, clear software development process.
The problem is that a lot of engineers, they're great problem solvers. They're wizards. They're like the Jedi of the modern era, right? And the problem is that when you give them vague requirements, they're not going to like freeze and go, well, I don't know what to do with that. They're going to go, fine, I will solve the existence of those vague requirements by building a sophisticated and flexible domain agnostic solution, and then inherit a whole bunch of technical debt and inherit a bunch of functional requirements that are implicit, and everything will go slowly. And worse than that, as I was saying earlier, you'll never actually end up delivering that delightful self-serve, easy to use, easy to understand product that we're all trying to do that'll ultimately scale and ultimately build a great company. So yeah, that is one of those unintended and subtle consequences of having this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this kind of lying to yourself, this lack of faith that you can be a great Silicon Valley company and making these kind of dual decisions at each turn. Now, there is a whole laundry list of other things that will start to go wrong, subtle and obvious dysfunctions that'll occur. We've talked about some of these in previous episodes. The one that comes to mind is choosing the right business model for the problem you're solving. Oftentimes, a classic example of hedging, of not having enough faith, of not acting with consistency about your vision is choosing a B2B business model where really your business is crying out for a B2C model. We won't unpack that one again. If you'd like to learn more about that, go back to the episode about business models and you'll hear us talk about that for another hour or so.
What I'd love to finish with here is to talk about a kind of meta dysfunction that happens here, which is that as a leadership team or as a leader, you start to lose your credibility with your own team. And it's something that I've kind of talked about, I guess as someone who's been an operator and then turned into a founder. And there are a lot of different ways for leaders who start off as strong leaders with a strong internal following to lose their credibility. But this is probably, in a way, the most pernicious one, which is that in a sense, the leader becomes viewed as a hypocrite by their own team, right? Because they say one thing, they paint this vision of a Silicon Valley style unicorn startup, but then in their actions, they do something else. And if you have hired smart people, they will realize that. If you have not hired smart people, then you're on a hiding to nothing anyway. But if you hire smart people, they will realize that. And you start eroding your own credibility, and then you start eroding your culture. You end up in a situation where if people do not really believe in the vision that their leader is sharing to them, they become cynical. They become more selfish, more political. Over time, some of the best people who actually buy into the mission the most will leave. And then I've talked a few times in this episode about painting yourself into a corner. Well, if you have eroded your own culture through your hypocrisy, even if you did not intend it to be hypocrisy, the perceived hypocrisy, if you lose your credibility as a leader, it is so hard to get it back. And so, in a sense, the die is cast, right? If you start to behave like this, then you have effectively set a course for your organization that is kind of the worst of both worlds, which is if you want the idealists, the people who want to change the world, you hire them and then you are letting them down. And yet the people who just want to build a business in one of the other ways that we talked about, Chris, they're not getting a clear message either, right? So you end up with this sort of emperor's new clothes situation nearly, where it's like everybody at the company kind of knows that you're not doing the thing that you say you were doing, but no one is quite brave enough to call it out because that would be an act of, I guess, direct rebellion against the leader. And people don't like to do that. They're more likely to either kind of check out or just quietly leave the organization over time. And going all the way back, Chris, to why I believe we started the podcast is this tyranny of low expectations, right? Where these companies end up failing to meet their potential because of their own actions. These self-fulfilling prophecies start to kick in, these negative flywheels, these vicious cycles, right? Where it's like, okay, we're no longer able to meet this massive ambition because we have started to corrupt our own decision-making. And then the culture, that glue, the magic that holds that dream together starts to fall apart. And once it's fallen apart, it's impossible to come back from.
Wow, yeah, this one resonates with me a lot because we had an episode recently about culture and how culture at startups and scale-ups are inherited from the top. And we're talking today about founders and maybe executives who are making these dualistic decisions. They're saying one thing but acting in a different way. But actually, that behavior will infect the entire culture. Well, yeah, we say we want to do that, but actually we need to make smaller, more tactical decisions. And they get the message, right? They start acting that way too. And so the whole company acts small. The whole company is compromised and corrupted. But what really also resonated with me, Yaniv, is like, you're right, that incredible people on the team will start to leave because they will detect this hypocrisy. They'll detect this duality. But I've also encountered a number of startups where investors start to get wind of this, right? I've had a founder say to me, hey, the board doesn't trust us to be as bold as you're suggesting we should be, Chris. And then when I spoke to the board said, we don't trust this founder to lead decisively and be bold. And they continually equivocate, which is why we keep trying to micromanage them because they're not leading. So they're both looking at each other, and it's really the founder who's lost the credibility. It's the founder who's managing to a balance sheet or managing to a mediocre outcome. And the board was almost like begging him to come back with a big, bold, ambitious Silicon Valley style plan for a Silicon Valley style outcome. They almost would say it over and over again, and he just couldn't get himself there because he felt like the board didn't really want that or didn't trust him or he didn't trust himself and so on. And so, in the end, I had to say, like, it really doesn't matter what the board thinks and what you think of the board. What matters is only what is in your heart of hearts. And you're pre-compromising your vision for what you think the circumstances are, what you think you're capable of doing, what you think the team is willing or able to do. And I'm like, put all that aside, figure out the ideal, and then we can compromise judiciously from there. And in fact, we have a whole other episode about working from the ideal and working from first principles. So there's a lot in the back catalog for you to go out and listen to after this episode, guys. So go check it out.
Absolutely. So maybe just to sum this up, because I felt something very powerful when you were talking right there, Chris, which is when we talk about the Silicon Valley style startup, we talk about making a dent in the universe, about building $1 billion company, about changing the world. There is this very delicate combination, this alchemy that happens between thousands, millions of real world decisions, of very practical, pragmatic thinking. And on the other hand, this element of magic, right? This element of magical thinking, of a type of beautiful, innocent arrogance that you can do this, right? This type of unwillingness to accept all the different forces that might drag you down. It was sometimes said of Steve Jobs, the reality distortion field, right? The way Silicon Valley startups work is this combination of the magic and then exceptional execution. And when you lie to yourself, this magic is a fragile thing. When you lie to yourself and then you lie to your team, you are killing the magic. And when the magic is gone, you cannot bring it back. When you were talking about this thing with the board, it's like, you know what? The magic is gone. And once the magic is gone, no one can really trust each other's boldness anymore. And then you fall back on, okay, here's a good opportunity to sign a big contract, or here's a good non-recurring engineering piece of work that will juice our revenue and get us to break even. So I kind of feel, summing up this episode, it's actually a warning. The magic is fragile. respect the magic. Don't lie to yourself, because if you get rid of that magic, no matter how badly you want it to come back, it is nearly impossible to bring it back. So treat it with love and respect and with the, I guess, the delicacy that it deserves.
I think that's part of the reason why I love startups so much, is that they are a little bit magical. They are a little bit ambitious. They are a little bit about defying gravity. They are about having a sober sense of what is real and pragmatic and achievable, and then saying, but I don't want to be tied to that. I want to defy that. I want to disrupt that. I want to rethink that. There's a wonderful saying, I don't know who said it, which is, our reach must exceed our grasp. Otherwise, what is heaven for?
God damn.
And, to me, startups have that kind of magic to them. It is not about this pure, clear-eyed, grounded pragmatism of everyday business, of everyday corporate life. It is about the magic, Yaniv, and I love, love, love that you injected that concept into this conversation to wrap it up. So really cool, guys. So go out there, imagine bigger and bolder, create magic, and bring everybody along on the journey. And I guess, as the title of this episode likely says, stop lying to yourself and dare to be great.
Fantastic, Chris. Okay, thanks so much for that. Now, folks, just before we wrap up, a couple of things. First of all, we will be recording a Q&A episode shortly, so we would love to get some of your best questions that we can answer on the show. So we will have a link to the question submission form in the show notes. Please, if you've got an idea or a question on your mind, send it through there and we will try to get to it in a future episode. Now, the other thing, Chris, is if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I'm worried that the magic at my company might be dying and I need to figure out how to hold on to the magic. Well, I know just the sort of wizard who might be able to help you with that sort of thing. Chris, I know part of your work is helping founders hold on to the magic and be true to their original vision. So if people want to work with you, how can they do that?
That's really right, Yaniv. I feel like often a lot of what I do is just helping founders remember their original vision and to execute in alignment with that vision. I often find them a little bit lost in the woods, having compromised and made all these trade-offs or acted in some ways that are misaligned with their original intent. And so, yeah, that's definitely something I do a lot of. Feel free to visit chrissaad.com/advisory and you can learn more about it there.
Fantastic. All right, folks, have a great week. Chris, see you in the next one.
See you in the next one, mate. Bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Deal, the all-in-one HR platform for global teams. Deal are growing incredibly fast, and that's because of the amazing flexibility they provide. Go to deal.com/TSP, that's DEEL.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to learn more.